till the. Okay. So, hello and good evening for our May meetup about optimizing VSCode for PowerShell development. I'm really looking forward to the session because I think it's going to be really interesting. A little bit about myself. I'm Konstantin. I do work in PowerShell daily. I doing very much stuff with it. My Twitter handles, and you also can find me on LinkedIn and can connect with me if you want. Housekeeping, yeah, we will record the session. Mute your microphone, I think that's okay. And I think, Justin, it's fine for you if people can unmute and ask you questions if it's okay for you. And I also will monitor the chat and ask question. Yeah, today's speaker, I hope I pronounced his last name right, Justin Grote. He's a Microsoft MVP. He is a very active contributor to PowerShell and also, I think, a working group member in one of the working groups. And he maintains many PowerShell open source projects like Press, and he's written 2 or 3 secret management modules. And I think Press, your module building framework, and so on. And yeah, without further ado, Justin, please take over. And yeah, let's start with your session then.
All right, thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and take over the screen here. So thanks everybody for having me. I appreciate it. Again, my name is Justin Grote. I'm a data center solutions architect with Ally Digital. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, and yeah, I've been working with PowerShell for about 12 or 13 years now. Kind of got started before back in the 1.0 days, but then Exchange 2007 is where I really needed to get into it, as a lot of people did during that time frame. And you know, there's always this saying that's done by Jeffrey Snover, the creator of PowerShell, which is the PowerShell sacred promise, which is that if you take the time to learn PowerShell, it'll be, you know, one of the greatest investments that you've ever made. And you'll see Twitter thread actually just went up recently of all kinds of people, including me, saying that was actually very true. I'd say that PowerShell has been one of the best things for my career that I've ever done, and so I'm very thankful to also help share my knowledge and go through that. So today's session is going to be about optimizing Visual Studio Code for PowerShell. This isn't going to be like a Visual Studio Code intro or anything like that. There's lots of really great resources for that. I'll cover some of those up here in a minute. This is mostly going to be around going through and lots of little tips and tricks and tunings and tweaks to get Visual Studio Code, you know, in a really nice place to be able to be really productive with PowerShell, especially like if you're using the ISE or if you're using things like Notepad or Notepad++. You know, ways to really help supercharge it so you can be much more productive and just have like a better quality of life when working with PowerShell. Yeah, as mentioned, I have no problem with questions. So anything here, you can just unmute and interrupt me or raise hand, you know, whatever works for this user group. You know, if you want to do the raise hand and have the moderator, you know, interrupt me or just call out, interrupt, it works for me either way. This is primarily meant to be a knowledge transfer session. This is done as sort of an unplugged session where I'm just going to do a live demo. We're going to go through things. Things are probably going to break. Stuff is probably not going to work, but that's the whole point, is that, you know, whatever issues I come across doing things are probably things you might come across. And so you can see how I fix those too. So that's going to be the general plan for today. And we'll just get to this. For some reason I have to. So right off the bat, I'm going to have these references here. Obviously, these are going to be in the recording. But these are just sort of like for getting started beyond where I'm at. So the first item is a video that I made about, I think, a year or 2 ago that is a lot of the same sort of information. I'm actually going to cover a lot of different stuff that's in this video, but that video covers a lot of additional tips and tricks. So if you like what you see here, definitely check that out. It's a bit older, but it's a lot of the stuff still applies. The next item is sort of like what I recommend as the starting off point, which is the using Visual Studio Code for PowerShell development. This is an article on the PowerShell documentation that covers a lot of the basics of getting started, using ISE mode, doing the debugger. It's really good content that covers that stuff really quickly. And then if you're somebody who isn't really using Visual Studio Code today or using ISE, you may or may not know that there's an ISE mode that's been built into the VS Code extension that tries to get it as close to ISE as possible within Visual Studio Code, especially around the look and feel to sort of help you transition. I started using Visual Studio Code about 4 or 5 years ago when it became clear that's what the new official PowerShell editor was going to be, and PowerShell ISE was going to be deprecated and no new features added. And it was jarring. It took a lot of work and a lot of brain switching to get into the world. But I mean, I couldn't be happier now that I'm in Visual Studio Code. I would never go back. And one final thing I just want to plug, a fellow colleague and friend of mine, Adam Driscoll, runs this company, Ironman Software. He makes PowerShell Universal, if you've heard of that. But he also makes a thing called PowerShell Pro Tools, which is an additional extension that adds all sorts of refactoring and tools and all kinds of things to make PowerShell really effective. And so definitely check that out. It's it's inexpensive, and I like to plug his tools because he makes some great stuff out there.
Yeah, we had him on last month to talk about Universal and Pro Tools. So yes.
Yeah, Adam's great. So you guys already know.
Really nice.
And, he's an awesome dude, and he deserves every penny you give him. So
definitely.
All right. So again, that's it for my slides. We're gonna get to the demo, and we're gonna call it good there. So first thing I want to show is I'm going to start with a fresh Visual Studio Code installation. And if you go to, let me go ahead and bring up Visual Demo browser up here real quick. So if you go to just code.visualstudio.com, you have this place to download for Windows. And whoops, where's the, this takes you, there's a better page for this. Where is it? There we go, other platforms. I just need to scroll down. They changed this site on me. So you have all these different options for installation. You can install in user space, which is great if you're on like a work computer or something where they don't have admin rights, or you need to have temporary access to a server. This will just put in your local app data. So it's a great way to have Visual Studio Code, even if you don't have admin rights to your system. Like, you generally don't have to ask somebody to install it. At the very least, too, you also have this option to just download it as a zip and have this sort of version. And so the nice thing about the zip is there's this thing in Visual Studio Code called portable mode, where here I have my Visual Studio Code that's just in a zip. And in here, I can take this and just simply go ahead and in this folder, do a new folder, make a folder called data. So when you do this, this creates a thing that basically makes this Visual Studio Code go into what is called portable mode. So what portable mode does is now, rather than save it in your directory, like your personal user settings, it saves everything about the Visual Studio Code in this data folder. So all your settings, your extensions, everything. So this gives you a version of Visual Studio Code that you can pick up and take anywhere. You put it on a USB disk, you can rezip it and then email it to somebody, and you have a Visual Studio Code instance ready to go for your work. So this is really nice when you want to try out new things. Like if you want to try a new version of Visual Studio Code, or you want to try out some settings or some extensions, but you don't want to mess with your existing installation, great way to like test and demo stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and start up Visual Studio Code here by double clicking it.
Yeah, I can also run VSCode's productive and insider side by side. It's also cool.
Yeah, you can do that with the user installers too. I run insiders day to day, but it's also a great way. Yeah, again, if you want to play around with a certain version of insiders, or you need a certain version for compatibility reasons because something broke, it's great for all kinds of those purposes. So you get here, you get your sort of getting started, and I'm going to do a keyboard shortcut. If you don't know this keyboard shortcut, it's either F1 or Control-Shift-P. This shows the command palette for Visual Studio Code. If you learn no other shortcut than this shortcut, this is the shortcut to know, because this is Google for VS Code. In this panel, everything you can possibly do in VS Code shows up, from extensions to everything, and you can type, search, etc. So the thing I'm going to do is enable this thing called screencast mode. So if you enable screencast mode now, when I do like Control-Shift-P, notice it shows what I ran as well as what the command is that's associated to that. So really good if you're demoing, and also see when I click, it does the little circle and stuff. So screencast mode is great for what I'm doing right now, screencasts. So we got a basic Visual Studio Code. We have our getting started and all that kind of stuff. So the first thing you generally want to do is install PowerShell. I have my PowerShell installed as PowerShell. Let's see, am I up to date? I'm going to get demerits if I'm not up to date. I think I'm on 7.2.2. I think, yeah, okay, good. So obviously, if you have to do Windows PowerShell day to day, that's great. But I always recommend also having PowerShell, maybe PowerShell Preview installed. because you can switch between them really easily. They run side by side. A common misconception is that by installing the newer PowerShell, you can't use the old PowerShell anymore, and that's not true at all. They're totally side by side, so you can have both on the same server or computer or wherever you need to do your work. And writing your stuff in 7 is just, it's going to be faster, it's going to be easier. There's tons of new features. Definitely worth checking out if you aren't. And most of my stuff today I'm going to be demoing is going to use 7. So in the extension marketplace, you have a lot of options for Visual Studio Code extensions. And so, it can be intimidating. Obviously, one you always want to get is the PowerShell extension. And there's a few of these. But if you go down here, there's an extension written by this very handsome individual right here called the PowerShell extension pack. So this is something that I made. It's very easy to make. If you go to the repository, you'll see it's basically just a JSON file with recommendations. If you go to the package JSON, so it's just, this is literally it. This is the extension. Here's the stuff, here's some metadata, and then here's all the extensions I recommend. And so you can make your own extension pack and publish it very simply. They have plenty of easy instructions. But I made one that I keep and I maintain for Visual Studio Code. And so this includes all these different extensions that I feel are good for an environment where you're doing PowerShell development, more specifically PowerShell development using GitHub. So it includes a lot of extra GitHub tools too. And so you can choose to just click install here and get everything in the pack. Or if you want to pick and choose and click individual things, you can do that too. Since I just have this test instance, I'm just going to railroad it and let it go through and install everything. And then that stuff's going to start coming in. It's just going to go out, fetch all those extensions, and get them ready. So while it's doing that, I am going to show one other thing, which is keyboard shortcuts. So here in this thing, you have a thing for keyboard shortcuts, and you can open your keyboard shortcut reference. And so in here, just like the command palette, is every single keyboard shortcut that exists, in the environment. And the nice thing about this too is that in addition to this, every single command that you see in the Workbench palette, with the Control-Shift-P, everything you see here can be bound to a shortcut. And so if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see all this stuff that you can choose, and more stuff's going to show up as these extensions come through and get installed. So in addition to what was in the command palette, GitLens is now showing up, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And so now we have all this nice stuff. And so anywhere here, you can make a new shortcut. Like if you like to have copy in GitLens, you can double click it and make a shortcut. But more importantly, there's this nice little when parameter where you can make shortcuts that say only occur in the terminal or only occur in the active editor. You can put shortcuts in all these special places. So one of the shortcuts that I like to do is in PowerShell 7, I really like to write what are called, custo style pipelines. So if I switch this over to PowerShell, actually, let me go ahead and make a new folder on the desktop for our demo here. And we will open that in our Visual Studio Code. Do I trust the author? Well, I am the author, so yeah, sure. And so now here we are in this folder with the on-the-fly demo. So one thing I like to do is one of my first optimizations. This is a personal preference, but one of the options I like to do is move this side panel to the right. So you can toggle the primary sidebar position, and it'll flip it over to the right. So the reason I like this is when you're working on code, when you expand and close it, your code doesn't move. It stays in the same place. Let me blow this up a little bit. And when you expand and close, your code stays in the same place. Whereas if you have it over here, your code's moving all over the place as you go through here and click things. And that just annoys me. So I like that. That's one customization you can do that I really like, is one of the first things you can do. This is kind of a religious thing. We can have all kinds of arguments about it, but this is kind of like how I like to see it. So if you see it over there, that's pretty simple. Just do that toggle sidebar position. And one thing to note is everything you do here in your settings, you can see that when I do that, it automatically adds that customization to my settings. So if I zoom out, see how it's automatically updating the zoom level for my settings. Everything's in this preference file. Works great, super useful. One other thing I want to point out is the settings sync feature. If you've never used this, it's very simple. You can turn it on. You can sync either with a GitHub account or a Microsoft account. I like to sync it with just my GitHub account. And what this lets you do is it lets you take all your settings, everything that I'm doing here, and synchronize that with a lot of different Visual Studio Code installations, including if you use things like GitHub code spaces or like the VSCode.dev. Like if I pull up VSCode.dev here real quick. If you're not aware of that, this is just an easy way to get VS Code in the browser right off the bat. Now, PowerShell doesn't work in here because this only runs in your browser, and you can't really run PowerShell in here until some stuff happens, which may or may not happen. But for now, you have a VS Code right here. But you can do the same settings sync here, and all your settings that exist in your desktop Visual Studio Code can carry over to this one. So where it's more useful is if you're using GitHub Code Spaces, because GitHub Code Spaces actually run in a virtual machine. You can do PowerShell in that, and then you can sync all your settings between your local desktop and that one, as well as you can sync settings to the ones that run in containers. If you do SSH remoting, which is awesome if you've never seen it, as you have a headless server, but also just use VS Code as if it was local, you can sync settings to that. And they made it really simple, but it's really powerful and really effective. You can exclude settings, etc. I talk about that in the other video, and definitely worth checking out, though. If you haven't seen the settings sync, or you're using one of the other third-party sync extensions, you can take those and throw them in the trash, because this one's super good, super nice, works really well.
And it also will separate your insiders and productive VS Code separately. Settings sync.
Yeah, if you choose to do so. Typically, I work in insiders, and I find most insider stuff just carries over to VS Code and works anyways. So even on my insiders, you can tell that your insiders sync to use your stable VS Code sync, so that you can have the same settings across both insiders and stable. But if you want to maintain that separation, or you want to maintain different accounts for different things, like a work account and a personal account with different settings for each, again, it's very, very comprehensive, and I highly recommend it. All right, so we're in my on-the-fly demo, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a PowerShell file here. Do I want to install recommendations for PowerShell? I believe I already have, but unless it hasn't come all the way down. Oh, see, look, oh man, I knew 723 would come out before I did this, so we can do that later. I'm just going to go ahead and reload my window here real quick. Hopefully it'll know that that extension exists. There we go. And PowerShell, it's because I told it to. Let's uninstall that. We don't need it. So yeah, if you have PowerShell and PowerShell Preview, very recently, the PowerShell Preview extension that with all the major, very heavy work on the core engine, like 2 years of work, lots of people work on it. It's all behind the scenes, so it looks like nothing's happening. But if you go to the GitHub repo and look at the Git commit history, you'll see there's just been a ton of work on the extension. Finally went stable as of like a week ago. So there's generally no reason not to run the Preview extension. Everyone works to try to keep this very stable, like not a lot of crazy experimental or half-broken things go into it. But if you, for whatever reason, you have a work thing that needs stable, I used to, up until about a week ago, I'd always say, like, use the Preview extension. It's so much better. But now the Preview extension is now moved to stable. So if you use stable, you now have all of the main features. So if you've been using the PowerShell extension within the last week to a month or so, you already have the new update. You may have noticed it's a lot more stable. The Intellisense is a lot quicker. All that pipelining has been rewritten. And there's lots of neat new stuff, like I wrote a new thing for the variables window where you have an auto window for the debugger. There's all the snippets I rewrote, so some of them still have bugs in them, but you got all kinds of nice new snippets, like the parallel pipeline function. That'll go ahead and get you all that stuff, and just very quickly, all the snippets have been rewritten, so they're a lot more useful. All right, so what we're going to do next is, one thing I want to show is when you have a Git repository, we'll just go ahead and make this init. When you have the GitHub extension, go ahead and do a sign in here real quick. Hopefully it picked up the right one. Maybe, maybe not. I think that hit the wrong browser, but we can try it again. All right, we'll just do this the normal way. I'm just going to do a git init here. So one of the nice things about the extension pack is an extension that if you haven't used it and maybe you're kind of getting used to Git, you don't really do a lot of command line stuff with it. There's really great comprehensive tools for Visual Studio Code that really you don't need the secondary things like GitHub Desktop or Git Kraken anymore. So one of my favorites is this tool called Git Graph. So what Git Graph will do, I should probably make an initial commit. Save that, go over here. Here is my thing. I'm going to commit this. First commit. And so now that I have that, if I click my Git Graph, I get this really nice visual view of my repository. So I have this thing, I'm on main, I'm on my first commit. Make a change. And if we're doing this sort of like how we typically would, is like we're not going to commit directly to main. We're going to make a new, we're going to make a feature branch called like my new change. And so when I make this branch, you'll see, oh, look, here's that branch. We'll go ahead and here's my new change. And if we look at Git graph, it automatically updates. And so you can see on our graph, here we are, but here's also our feature branch. Let's say in the meantime, we go back to main. And in the meantime, somebody went through, they made a change, they did their whole pull request. And if we look at our Git graph, you see now we have this branch. So there's my first commit. Now we're at this new place change in the meantime, and now my branch is sort of off from what the main branch is. So, but if I go back to my new change, so you can do all the usual, merge and such as you could before. But what's nice is this has all kinds of interactive stuff here. So you can just right-click and choose merge or reset or rebase, and all of that works in here. So if I take that, merge into current branch, that looks good. Actually, I want to merge this into current branch. And so I get my conflict, and that shows there. And we can see all those details and see the merge changes, see what our conflict is. Hey, there was this, whereas this one was this. Get all that sorted out, and it's great. And then so I can go back to my main. We'll do a git reset. And now we're back to normal, back to main. So that's a really handy way to visually see everything you're doing in Git, and especially like if you're on a remote repository. Like, let me go ahead and open just for an example. Let's do like something that's gonna have a lot of changes there. Well, probably the PowerShell repository. So we bring up our Git graph for this, and you'll get all the stuff that's going on. So if I show all branches, show my remote branches, you can see everything that's going on in the PowerShell repository, and where it's at in the origin, at where everything's going on, who made the changes, all that stuff. Super helpful, super useful. And to do this one in Visual Studio Code, reopen my old folder, which I can go here to recent. Okay, so so now we're back to where we were. So one other thing that's really nice is that you have this git lens too, which the git lens will add all kinds of nice stuff like git blames. Like if you see a lane like, hey, who changed this thing? You can see it was you, dummy, 2 minutes ago. You're the one who did it. What time? Then you got all the usual stuff. Contact your team. Do all that kind of stuff. Start a live share. So like if there's a bug in the code, you can start a live share session and bring other people into your session, and you can all interactively work on it and figure it out. We did this with at PowerShell Summit. We did our Iron Scripter. We had one live share going so that people wouldn't have to write over each other and avoid conflicts, and it worked out pretty well. And we ended up winning the Iron Scripter competition, so that was great. So one other thing we're going to go through here, I'm going to show something new. There's this thing called file nesting now. So one thing that's really nice is like maybe you have your test, or let me call this do this. Call this my script, and let's make a Pester test for it. I'm going to call this my script.tests.ps1. And so let's say in my test, it's going to be describe my script. And actually, I can use the snippets here. Oh no, I think I kept them in. Describe my script. Oh no, we took out the Pester snippets because they're going to move elsewhere. So it does what it should. And we're going to say so when we run this script, the output should be this. So we'll try it. Okay, great. My script works as I expected it to. So there's this neat new thing called file nesting, which is added in a recent version of Visual Studio Code. So if I go to my normal Insiders instance, I got to go find the settings for it. So we're going to go to our preference settings. Go to my settings here. Where's my PowerShell specific settings? Let's see. So we have these things. I'm going to copy this. There's going to be a lot of stuff at once, but don't worry, I'm going to go through it. All right, so here's this section for file nesting. So the first setting is just to enable it. And then the next part are where you specify your patterns. So the way that these patterns work is you say what kind of file you want to have and what you want it to map to. So in this case, we added PS1, and I want my test files, where basically whatever the file name is that matches this star, in this case, my script, I want anything that matches my script.test.ps1 to get nested under that file in the view. So when I go to save that, look over here, you see now my test is expanded under where my script is. So where that's really super useful is that you can organize your tests and have them in a separate folder or have them in the same folder as the files, but very clearly show the relation to those. So another thing I typically do too is, like, when you're making a PowerShell module, you have a PSD one and a PSM one. So I usually make it so that the PSM one sits under the PSD one, because I rarely actually touch that. That's usually just to go and dot source all the other stuff, but I want to show that that relation exists. So it's a really handy way to organize. And you can do this with anything. If you have format files or you have demo files that you want to nest under particular things, it shows here. And so the file, the file system is still the same. If you go to the file system, it's still in here, just that and that. But in here, you have them nested, for your own view. So really handy, a great way to organize things. And I'll show. Let me open a example. I'll open one of my Screen Connect or secret management repositories. That is what is known as a bad example. Let me go find another one. Oh, no, this one's got a couple. Okay, so here's an example of this one. I'll blow it up a bit. So if you look over here on the right, close all my various random crap, you'll see, like, here's get secret and there's get secret tests. And I use VSCode icons. I have some customizations here so that my Pester tests have a nice little icon to them. But you can see I can suck these up. And so if I don't want to see the test, great. But when I want to work on the test, I can expand it and look at it. And there's all my detail for my test. So while I'm in here, one thing you may have noticed is all my tests have this nice little arrow next to them. This is thanks to a extension that I wrote called Pester tests, naturally. And this comes in the extension pack. But with this extension basically integrates the native VSCode testing UI that was added in about the last 6 months and makes it work for Pester tests. So in Pester, I have these runs over here. And so you have the option to run it. And you'll notice, like, if you have tests that have test cases, it'll automatically expand the various test cases that you have. And so I go and reveal this in the Test Explorer. All of your Pester tests have this nice little UI tree. And you can take a test and you can run it. I don't know if it's going to work or not. Okay, so I had an issue here probably because this thing's broken. But yeah, I'm on the wrong branch here. So none of these tests are going to work, but that's just because my stuff's at work. This one might work. Let's find out. Worked last time. Yeah, now I can't find the files because I'm in a branch where I haven't downloaded the changes, and it's all. Example. Let me find that one. You guys still there? Sorry, it looked like I dropped connection there for a second.
No, everything is fine.
No? Okay, good. This laptop's had a weird graphics driver thing. Sometimes it drops the connection for just a second. But what's I bet PowerShell maps test still work. And we'll see if it loads. You'll see the Pester extension loads down here. And it waits for PowerShell to load. And then it'll usually show up over here in, like, the test pane. But there's this other new thing that, if you haven't seen it, called the side panel. So if you do the secondary sidebar visibility, you make a shortcut to it. And Visual Studio Code, you now can have this secondary bar where you can put things. So you're used to this. And if this is flipped, then it's just the other side. So you can have your normal bar where you put this. But for instance, I like to have this little pullout that has my outline, my breakpoints, and my test. That's separate from my normal bar over here. And so if I go here and I take a test, and I run it, let's hope this one works. Okay, good, that one works. So I have this nice little view for all my tests, and I can run them, and I can see if they work, and see how long that test took to run. And you can even debug the test, so you can put a breakpoint on it. So if I go to this test, see there, stopped at the breakpoint, I can check it, I can see this. There's this other extension that comes in extension pack called Inline Values that Tyler wrote, where when you're debugging, when you get to a point, it'll quickly show you relevant, what your relevant values were at that point. So it's really easy to see what's going on. And in the new VS Code extension, in the variables pane, there's this new auto view, which basically tries to intelligently figure out what variables are relevant to your current context. You can still get to all the other ones. So, if you go to like local, there's all that stuff. If you go to global, there's all that crap. But what it tries to do is it tries to figure out, hey, in your scope, you're using these variables. So these are probably the variables you care about the most at this point. One other thing you'll notice is that for arrays and hash tables, I also rewrote this part, so it's much, much cleaner. You can see that you get just a very nice list view here, whereas before you had all this extra information under this raw view header. Like all this stuff used to see all this, and it was a bunch of noise. Now you just get this really nice view, but you can see all the extra information if you want still. And then, so that's really nice, handy for the debugging. And of course, you have your call stack and the Pester test tree. And if you have a test that is errored, you can go to the test and it has all the detail about the error. Like you can show, can't convert. If it's an expected actual type test, it'll show what the value was expected as well as what it is actually, and have that show up. So let's see if we can do some of that in our test here. Sometimes I have issues with my Pester test extension triggering. It is still somewhat preview, so we will see if we can get it to do what it needs to do. I don't see it even initializing here, so maybe I just need to do a reload. Let's see. Sometimes, like if you start it but you don't have a Pester test off the bat, it's not going to find it. Okay, there we go. So the Pester test extension will tell you, hey, do you want to disable the Pester code lens here because it's not compatible? Usually you just want to say yes, and it'll take care of that. I won't worry about my version right now. Okay, so now I get my arrows. So now I can run my test. There it is, looks good. Let's say it doesn't match. And when I save, one thing you can do is you can enable run on save. So as I go and I change this, if I go back, delete it back out, save it, it'll automatically run the test each time so that you can get really quick feedback. If you want to disable that, you just go down here and click this, and it can pause it or resume it. And I'll just go ahead and put like a GGG in here. So now, if I go and I change my code elsewhere, as soon as I save, I can see, oh, my test broke. And I can see exactly why my test broke. Hey, I was expecting this, but I got this. And you can see where it is, and you can even see the test history. It's like, okay, well, this test worked back here. I can go back to that version. I can look at the detail of the test, see, what the Pester full detail was of that test. And instead, like, okay, well, why is this happening? Now I can debug it. So if you run it over here, it runs in a special process. If you click it here, it'll run it in debug mode. So you can also right click and choose debug test. And you'll see it'll debug me, and it'll take me right to that point. And I can see, okay, there's the script. It looks good. It should be that, and I can find out where I'm at and figure out, take this interactively, run it at this point, and go, PS script root doesn't work interactively, but we take that out and be like, yeah, I suck at this. There we go. It's like, oh, okay, I see where I screwed up. It was supposed to be that. And so now I need to go here, fix that, stop that, run it again, check my test, and my test is good. So yay. So if you haven't seen Pester testing before, it can be this simple, where you can also just simply be it. Like half the time, my first Pester test is this. It runs. And like, does that work? Great. It runs. Awesome. If it screws up, oops. Let's try that again. Oh, okay. My test doesn't run. It had an error. But like you can start, like this is as simple as a Pester test can be that you can write. And as you go, you can write your script and then just keep testing. And then if it breaks, you can debug it to figure out where it broke. So like I can pause there. You can do this thing called error action preference break. And now if I do this and I debug this, oops, I ran it, said debugging. I debug it. We got to the point, okay, we're going to run the script. Let's see what happens. Okay, it broke. You notice I didn't have to set a breakpoint. It just broke where the terminating exception happened. And then I can go in here and figure out, okay, what happened? Look at the object, look at the context, look at my debugger, move my side panel to the right. Look in here and see, okay, here it is, what broke? It's like if you had variables here, like if this was a variable, I could see, oh, okay, that's what screwed up. You can watch things, all that kind of stuff. And so really handy using Pester to do your debugging rather than just trying to do it interactively or using like write host statements. is really handy, and especially when stuff gets really complicated or when you screw stuff up like I just did. It can be really handy. So one thing you see there is like you notice, you may have noticed that sometimes when I mess things up, it's throwing in these little extra characters for me. Like if I do, notice how I do that and I reference that, but notice how I get this automatic highlighting here that tells me what errors or warnings are occurring. This is provided by an extension called Error Lens. So this extension is part of the PowerShell pack as well. And what it does is typically you're used to seeing the problems down here. But what this does is this basically takes anything that shows up down here, and this works for everything, not just PowerShell, anything that shows up down here and gives you a nice contextualized location of where the issue is happening. So this is great because you can see, oh, I didn't use this variable. So if I want to instead throw $X, okay, now I fixed that. If I leave off a quote, it shows where the problem is. And you get that much faster feedback. Like it's much easier for you to see, like, right away where you screwed up. And especially what's nice is, it goes as you work on the fly. So if you're working on a big script and, you change something that might remove a variable, suddenly you get the warning, you can scroll up to see where it is. And it just sort of helps you fix those problems before you have to find them, during testing, or even worse, have your user report it to you as an error. One other thing I want to show is I've been saving this file as we go. Another great new feature in VS Code that's been added is called local file history. So if you look at this individual file, there's this thing called local history, and you can do find entry to restore. Let's go to my script, and so you can see here, even though I am using Git, you can do this with anything. If you've ever changed the script and you maybe were on a website you thought, and then you typed a bunch of stuff, and then you hit save, and you didn't realize that that's saved in your script, but then you can't find what you changed, like maybe you threw an underscore in there accidentally, and now your script's broken. But you haven't done a git commit in between the last time you did it and now to figure out where the problem is. Typically that can be super frustrating. You got to rewrite everything. However, here, wherever you last saved, you can go to it, and you can go to every time you save in VS Code, you can go to where it's at and find out what the change is. And that's not just PowerShell scripts. That's every single file in VS Code. It's on by default now. So if you're using VS Code stable, it's just there. So definitely check it out. Super useful. I bind a key to it so that I can just be like, if I'm like, where is something, you can just take this find history to restore, bind a key to it, and be good to go.
Is it the same as the, sorry to interrupt, sorry.
Yeah.
Is it the same as the timeline that you find in the right bottom here? Yeah.
It is. So this, so the timeline used to show only Git history. Now it shows your actual files. So yeah, so you can do it, local file history to restore this way, or if you like the timeline view, you can do it this way too. So yeah, but again, great new feature, super helpful, especially if you're going through, you're saving stuff on a script and then you fat finger something and you can't figure out where you were, really nice to just go back and figure out where that problem is. And
you don't need, I think you don't need a Git repository for this. So you can have it. So it's like a Git repository light.
Yeah, it doesn't use Git history. It literally what it does. Think of it more like when you edit a document in Word and you can go to recovered versions. It's closer to that. But you don't have to Git commit to do things. It doesn't have to be a Git repository. It can be literally anything. Yeah. Okay. So one other thing I really like is I have a tendency to write a lot of sort of things that don't quite warrant a module. If I'm in the PowerShell Discord and somebody has a question about the best way to do something, that's an interesting problem. Let me see if I can solve that for them. So what I will do is I will typically create a gist. So in GitHub, there's these things called gists, which are basically simple throwaway code things. And actually, let me get to my personal one because I don't want to go through a whole login. And get to personal gist.github. Hide this real quick. That's going to make me elevate anyways with my phone. Logged into this guy on that account. Well, come on, show me the money. All right, there it is. 56. Approve. All right. So this is, if you go to gist.github.com, you can go to all gists and see all of them. This is my personal one. So if you go to git./Justin Grote, here's all my gists. So these are basically just quick one-off things you could write. So here's something I wrote recently, a really handy tool that complements select string that lets you very quickly get to the matches of a select string. By default, it's kind of tricky. You got to use a You got to do like the $result, .matches, .groups. Like it's very unfriendly. So like this has a lot of different ways to do it. Like here's some code here where I just like, here's my regex. I want this does dot, and then select the matches, and it just gives you the matches. You know, and if I'm doing like a regex like this with a named capture group, and I just want the capture group, great. If I want it as a hash table, great. So this is something that doesn't warrant like a whole module just to provide, but it's here so that you can grab it and fetch it. But the thing about these is that these are all complete full actually Git repositories. So you can check these, you can see the revisions, but every GIST you can check out. But what's nice is that there's an extension called GISTpad, which makes this a really nice native integration. Let me go to my demo of VSCode here real quick. Actually, probably better do the other one because I don't have it set up there. But basically, you just log in, and then you can have it wherever. I think here I just have it on my main Explorer bar because I use it so much. Zoom out there a little bit. And so here under my GISTs, you know, I have all my different GISTs that I have. So when I go here and I want to make a new GIST, you know, some idea I'm working on, my script.ps1, there it is. It's that simple. And so now I have the some idea I'm working on. And you can do this thing as open as a workspace, open a new window, and that'll check out the repository. You can clone them, you can export them. And then again, when you want to go see it, so there's that GIST. I just created it. I never had to touch GitHub. I never had to go there. And I have a GIST right there in my VS Code that I can work on. I can add stuff to it. This is a bad script. And as soon as I save, in the background, it automatically uploaded it. So if I go here again to my GIST, see, now it's up to date. So great way to just quickly write code, not have to know anything about Git, but have a Git repository that has your code in it as a GIST and be able to quickly share that information. I made this one secret just so it doesn't show up, but I can easily just make it public when I'm ready. And so awesome extension, great way to be able to share code really quickly without having to do a PowerShell gallery publish or really even learn GitHub that much. You can just create them here and work through them, browse them, work on them, all that. Great feature. So I do recommend that very much. Another nice one is Zip Explorer. Zip Explorer you can take any zip and click on it, and it'll just show you the contents of it and work within it. And then let's see, the next thing I want to show, this is something that Patrick showed me, Seemingly Science. If you don't know him, he is a brilliant, brilliant dude. So one thing that annoys me, I think I was talking about this earlier, is, you know, when I'm writing here, I really like the new way of doing pipelines. So if you're on PowerShell 7, you may not know that you can do this. If you're not on PowerShell 7, I should say, you may not know that you can do this. Your pipelines can be on a new line. And by the way, you notice how it shows these aliases. If you don't know you can do this, you can enable format on save or also just do format document, and it'll automatically expand the aliases for you. Except I haven't set up the settings for it. You got to go through here and so under PowerShell, there are a ton of settings. Definitely like playing through and looking at all these extensions. There's a ton of them, but you know, there's lots of good ones in here for setting, like if you want certain code stylings to set up. And so the one that I want here is there's one for aliases. Search for alias. Autocorrect aliases. So check that, enable that. And now when I do a format document, notice how it changes the question mark to where object. So you can write shorthand, but have your code come out in a way that's really useful for other people. So you can write a pipeline like this and then run it and, you know, get the results. So I like this style because like it's very clean, it's very nice, as opposed to doing the pipe here, or God forbid you do it this way. This kills kittens, don't do this. But this only works in PowerShell 7. But one thing that's kind of annoying is if you try to do it here, if you try to do a get child item and you do like what we would typically do on like a normal PowerShell console, which I'll bring up here. Get child item. Oops, wrong thing. My keyword, oh man, my keyboard thing's getting intercepted for that. There we go, sorry. On keyboard shortcut. So if you normally do shift enter, you know, pipe sort to make this work here. But if you do it here, if you try to do Shift Enter, it just runs the command. So like Shift Enter. And so, so how do we fix that? So Patrick had this nice trick where you can add in a key handler to bypass. I got to pull it up in my settings. Sure. Give me 1 second. Basically, you can add in a key handler to, first of all, tell VS Code, hey, for this particular keystroke, just bypass it. Let it go through to the terminal. And then you can add something to the terminal to then intercept that and make it work. So if I do my git ps readline key handler, should show up in here. Okay, so by default, it's, by the way, if you don't know, you can customize pretty much all the keyboard shortcuts at the command line with the ps readline key handlers. And so git ps readline key handler will show you all those. And you have a lot of different options, including you can create your own custom ones. One of my favorites is, this is a custom one that I've made, where I do git child item, and if I hit F1, it'll pull up the online help for it. So there's a new thing in PowerShell 7.2 where it'll do it in like a pager window, but if a command has online help, I want to see this help. So I made just a custom shortcut that when you do F1, it'll get that. There's another option that, like, you can have a selection and do Alt, oops, wrong one, oops. Alt Shift left bracket and automatically enclose it in parentheses. If I have something on in my clipboard, do like Lorem Ipsum. If I have some on my clipboard, I can do Control Alt V, which may not come through to the Control Shift V, which may not come through to the terminal. And the other one doesn't like that either. Well, typically when I do it, it will paste it as a here string, as it shows here. Another thing is, like, you can do this thing. We'll see if this works. I don't think this, yeah. So this one where you can toggle the type of quotes that something's using. So if you have like a long string that you're writing at the command line, I start this way. I'm like, this is great, and I decide, oh, I actually want a variable in here. I can just do Alt quote and then toggle it so that I can use the variable. So that's just an example. Like, these are really neat. I'm not going to go too much into these, but you can define your own user function keyboard shortcuts. So since we can do that, one of the things we can do is that, okay, what if we bound it to a key, because Shift Enter gets intercepted and it's not really easy to redirect that. What if we bind a different key? In this case, I just chose the down arrow, like it's a special character. What if we bind a different key to that for add line? And so if we bind that, that means if we can reference that key and have that pass through to the terminal, we can have that work here. So, and you do that with just set ps readline key handler. And then if you don't know, in Windows 11, you can do Windows dot, and it'll let you basically pick any kind of character. So I could have made this an emoji or whatever, but you can kind of pick a character that's not normally on your keyboard, which is a great thing here, is because we want to send what is basically a chord, where we just want to send a special character that we're never going to actually type, so that the terminal can interpret it. So basically, PS Readline knows that, hey, if this key is quote unquote pressed, I actually want you to do add line rather than actually do that character. So now that we have that, the next thing we wire up is in our settings. Go find it here real quick. We do a keyboard shortcut. And I got to find the right one here. There it is. Okay, so we have this keyboard shortcut. So we add this keyboard shortcut where we say the key that we want is when we type Shift Enter in VS Code, only when we're in the terminal. Again, this is like that focus thing that I talked about. And you remember I showed the UI version of this, that's here. But you can also just click this flip button and go to the JSON version. I have my UI, and what I want to do is in the workbench, I want to send a sequence to the terminal. And what I want to send is the Unicode representation of that down arrow. So now that I have that in there, it will send it to here, and then it will, once it's here, it'll interpret that and do an add line. So now I can do git child item Shift Enter, and it works. So that's a hack workaround for a Visual Studio Code oddity, but also shows you some of the power there. So as you're going through and optimizing your code for your instance, you can make shortcuts for anything. And basically anything you can write as a script block, you can make a shortcut in VS Code. Like if you want to have a shortcut that kicks off a whole CI pipeline, you can do that. There's all kinds of options. The sky's the limit when it comes to these PS Readline key handlers, and they're a very powerful and I think very underutilized feature of PowerShell. And you can just tie them in here with the keyboard shortcuts as necessary. So that's how you do a keyboard shortcut, tying through with the send sequence. I think we got about 10 more minutes that I'll go through a few more things, and then we can open up for just open questions. Otherwise, I can just go through some other various other tricks and tips and features. So let's see, what's a good next one? Let's do, let me go back to my demo instance here. These colors are very configurable. So if I go to, for instance, my sort of default one and find my settings for this, flip it, error lens rather, they're there. So one thing I like to do is I've done a bunch of work to do all kinds of, I really like the default VS Code theme, to the point that you probably saw when you go to, when you see my my Windows terminal, all the colors and everything actually match. So everything here looks the same here. And so I did a lot of work to make it so that these all line up. And so that's, I have that out on my GitHub in terms of the colors to make VS Code work that way. I think I go to the settings here and flip over the JSON, which hopefully should open VS Code, yeah. So I have a whole, color palette that makes that work. I think I've made a Campbell PowerShell. And I have a color palette for like the default colors and such. But what you can do with error lens is like, this is kind of bold. I don't like the fact that my errors are sort of the same boldness as my actual code. It's kind of distracting. Like, at least in my brain, when I see this, I'm like, is this part of my code or is this an error? Just like when I look at it immediately. Obviously, like eventually I can interpret that, but sometimes it takes me like a second to figure it out in my brain to realize what part's the code and what part's the actual error. So I like to tone these colors down a bit. So in my settings, under color customizations, I basically just have my versions of the colors. All these are terminal colors and such, but these are the key ones. So these error lens colors, I just have these individual colors, and then sort of the 10 at the end, this is an alpha color, which basically says I want this at 10% opacity, 40% opacity, 5% opacity. So when I save that in there, you'll notice now it's much more subdued and much more kind of like, okay, this is just like a helpful reminder that that info is there. And you can also do the quick fixes for those to solve them. That's really nice. You can do that with all kinds of different colors. Like I like these to be subdued. In the new VS Code, as you may have seen, if you notice all your brackets maybe look weird in the latest version of VS Code, that's because there used to be this extension called Bracket Pair Colorizer that was one of the best extensions, in my opinion. I would use it all the time. And that got that actually got rolled into VS Code as a production extension. But in the default settings, there are some things that I like to change to make it. So for instance, the bracket colors, you can change what your bracket color order is. And so I like to have them in a certain sequence so that I know what level that I'm at. And so you can actually see that already here. These ones are blue, these ones are purple, etc. And you can see like there's also this connecting line which shows that. That's a feature that you can add. Lots of settings for that. Check out those new settings for the bracket pair colorizer. Really helpful to figure out like where you're at and what you're working. Another extension I like is called Indent Rainbow. So you see in my settings JSON here, you probably noticed that there's these sort of colored gutters. So again, I'm using these custom colors for the thing, so it's a little more subdued. But these really are really useful, especially when you're working in things like YAML files, to figure out like what indentation level you're at. It's just a nice little visual representation so that if something's out of indent, you can get a nice little quick view of like, oh, this is not in the right place. So great for doing that, fixing YAML, working in white space sensitive languages, etc. Great extension. Again, that one is called Indent Rainbow. Hopefully this is the next one on the docket to be integrated into VS Code because it's super popular with 3 million. And so you can see and have those indents, and you can customize the styles, make it look however you want. And it works in the web-based versions like GitHub Dev. So that's a great extension. Another one I really like is VS Code has, the PowerShell extension has a lot of built-in alignment functions. So you can do test equals 5, test way over here 6, test way over here equals 7, test 8. And if I take this and I choose format document, you notice that it'll align everything in the hash table. So this is great when you're splatting. But there's a extension called auto align in my install, better align, excuse me, which basically works that you can specify what you want to align on, and it works with any kind of code. So for instance, if you want to do it with JSON, all you do is choose this align command. I have this bound to a command, and it'll auto align any kind of code, not just PowerShell code. So it's great if you have like JSON settings, YAML settings. If you want all this stuff to, you know, look really nice and clean, you can align it. So, you know, handy little extension there. All right, let's see, what else do I want to cover? So we got that, we covered the aspects there. You know, there's always the Intellisense, which is much better now, especially with, you know, like constructors, you know, if you want to do a, I don't know, string builder. You have this constructor information, and one thing that's new, if you don't know that you can do this, if I do a constructor, which I didn't like because I screwed it up. This box is resizable now, didn't used to be, so definitely if you haven't seen that, that's really helpful. And you can also do Alt-Enter here and see my details for the different constructors are here. I'm hoping to make this a little bit nicer like other languages are. Right now it just kind of has to be this way due to how this information is given to the PowerShell editor services from PowerShell. But you can see if you at least hover over it, it has sort of a nicer view of the different ways you can construct. You know, and so, you know, you can do it, yeah. You get the auto-completes that way. All right, let's see. So, you know, I guess one other thing is for my typical kind of dev work, there's this really nice, if you use GitHub Actions, there's this great extension for GitHub Actions that will show you your actions in real time without you having to go back out to GitHub Actions and look at the status. So if I, for instance, open a project that I have, probably have to do, again, because I'm not signed into GitHub, I'll probably have to do a different project on my main thing. Let's try with some of them. I think Press probably has some extensions still in the GitHub Actions. So you can see here, I can see all my GitHub actions, their current status, their steps, how things are going, and then down here in the gutter, it'll show in real time your action status. So if you're doing a, sorry about that, if you're doing a GitHub action, you know, if that's like testing your thing, in this case, like, you know, I'm testing, I'm setting up a job, I'm checking out, you can have all that, basically see it in real time here and watch it refresh. And the GitHub extension is also great if you haven't used it. So for instance, I have this repository that I made here, and I can go to my source control. Yeah. Save all, whatever. Everyone does that. Yeah, this button, publish branch. And so I got to sign into GitHub to do it. But basically, you can do all your stuff, including look at PRs, all that kind of stuff from right here within GitHub. So if I go to, for instance, the VSCode PowerShell extension, which is something I work on pretty often. I'll allow you to do this again in the non-demo version. Let's go, go projects, VSCode PowerShell. So with the GitHub, you know, you can see all the current pull requests, which ones are meant for me. You can go to the individual ones and check them out. So for instance, here's one that I made that lets you, if you're doing C# development, automatically attach the debugger from the VSCode so that you can debug both of them at the same time. And you can go ahead and check it out, work on it, open it in a dev container, all that kind of stuff. Really helpful if you're working GitHub, like you very rarely actually have to go out to the GitHub site. So if I want to see this issue, you know, I can see it. If I want to start working on it, choosing start working on will automatically create a branch and start working on it. And then you can automatically create a PR. You can look at the descriptions of the PRs right here in VS Code without having to go elsewhere. Great, awesome, super great extension for GitHub so that you basically never have to open the website. I mean, you do still do it for some things, but for the most part, like you can keep all your work local and keep that development loop tight without having to have different browsers and such open. So I think I will call it there for the first half of that. So as you can see, there's lots of ways you can customize VS Code. VS Code is such a has such broad support and has grown so huge that there's all these people making stuff all the time for it, and including, you know, the PowerShell team, and you can make your own extensions. Like the Pester test extension, like you show there, I use that as an excuse to learn TypeScript. You know, I didn't have to be part of the PowerShell team. I didn't have to be part of the PowerShell team to contribute to the VS Code extension. I just made a pull request and submitted it. Now, whenever you go to the variables view and you see that auto stuff, I wrote that. And I get to know that everybody who ever uses VS Code PowerShell extension now, if they ever use that, and like, oh, that's handy, I wrote that. And I'm not part of the PowerShell team. I didn't have to, like, you know, do any kind of vetting or sign NDA. I just made a pull request. And they said, hey, this looks great. And they accepted it, merged it, and it's there. And so, and part of the reason that I can do that kind of stuff is because I've worked hard over the years to heavily optimize my VS Code. I'm always looking for new things. I'm always looking through the release notes that come out for VS Code. They do a thing called VS Code Release Day, which is great, is every time a new version of VS Code comes out, they do a live stream and they talk about all the new features. Definitely check that out. It's awesome. There's a great YouTube channel called Code 2020, which I definitely recommend. Bring that up here. It's run by Matt Bierner, who actually runs a couple of really good extensions. And so, for instance, you know, here's his most recent one that he put up yesterday, where, hey, guess what? If you do F2 on Markdown headers, turns out it renames things everywhere. So, you know, stuff like that. This is a great channel with just tons and tons of tips. Like, you could just spend an afternoon just going through all these, and you'll just become so much more productive in VS Code just by going through them. So. So thank you guys very much. I hope this helps, gives you some ideas both of great ways to enhance your PowerShell using VS Code, as well as give you some ideas for keyboard shortcuts and stuff to start contributing your own things, and hopefully you put them out there for other people to use. So again, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was a lot that you showed us. Thank you very much. So any questions for Justin? That's, yes, he wants to go deeper or so. Amazing presentation, very grateful. Chat.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'll do real quick, I guess while we're here, let me go ahead and put that slide up with the references again so you have it. Nothing here. Most of these things are things that, like, if you just Google the names of them, you don't even need the URL. So, well, I got to go find where I put my presentation, which is probably in here. Whoops.
So I actually have a question about the launch configurations that you I think you showed that in your first presentation, the PowerShell 24, I think it was. 24 hours. So you can put launch configurations by project, or you can put them directly into your settings file.
Yeah.
Is it also possible to, if you put them directly into your settings file, load them by language that you load, or do you have to put it in?
Yeah, I haven't tried that. Like, you know, we could try it. Let's find out.
Yeah, because when I am doing some PowerShell development, or I will do some TypeScript or some C# or so, I don't want to have my launch configurations for PowerShell in there when I have them in the global settings file.
Yeah. So let's try this. Let me open my regular VS Code here. And let me get this demo one up. And we'll just reload this guy. Now let's bring up our setting. Oh, I'm not sharing. I'm sorry. Give me a second.
So for something that doesn't know what the launch configurations are, can you just go over real quick what a launch configurations is?
So what a launch configuration is, let me get this into just back to our desktop, our goofy on the fly demo here. So what a launch configuration does is basically there are different ways to basically run and debug PowerShell. So if you've seen this icon, the run and debug, you'll get this, and you'll see, hey, if you want to customize it, hey, you need to create a launch JSON file. So typically, historically with VS Code, these were always created on a per project basis. So every time you create a new project, you do a new launch one. And the VS Code extension has built in, like, hey, other extensions aren't this nice, but the VSCode extension is like, hey, we can give you easy, we've pre-programmed in a bunch for you. So my favorite typically is the interactive session one, where you just do this, and it's like, okay, I have my configuration. And then once you hit save, and you'll see it's saved in the workspace, not in your settings. Now if I go to run, in my dropdown, I have, this PowerShell interactive session. And what this is basically like, once you hit start, you'll notice the bar down here goes green, and now you're in debug mode for anything you do. So if I do my script, if I do this thing, do that thing, and put a breakpoint here, save it, and then run my script, it'll automatically drop into the debugger for that script. So like basically like once you turn on interactive mode, there's basically you're in debugging mode, and this is basically like like if you did like set PS breakpoint at a command line prompt, it does the same thing. In fact, that's exactly what happens. Is like if I go here and get PS breakpoint, if I hit run interactive session, you'll notice the breakpoint that I put here is now present. There's a bug where once I hit enter there, you notice how the bar went away. That was a bug that got introduced very, very recently in preview. We're going to get that fixed, but this is an easy way to just sort of debug and see where you're at and see all your variables and that kind of thing. So anyhow, so that's what a launch configuration is. And by default, there's all these different ones, and like a lot of them are pretty nice. So you can add configuration, and right here they've got them here. So like if you want to launch a script, but you want to enter a path as well as have certain arguments, I typically think this is better suited for Pester tests, but if people are teach their own. If you just want to run and test a script that way, attached to a process is really helpful if you're doing things like Azure Functions, or you have like a PowerShell executable that you've made that like you give out to a help desk where you need to troubleshoot the executable itself, but you want to attach to the process to figure out where you're going on. Doing remoting through SSH if you're trying to debug a remote machine. All kinds of great circumstances here, but the two you typically would use is interactive session and launch current file. And the launch current file you typically don't need anymore because it's built into the PowerShell extension now. If you just, I think it's under run. Yeah, so you just do PowerShell run, and this does basically the same thing as this. So if I open again my thing here, my script, run, it does the same thing, and we'll debug and stop there. So you really don't need to make that launch configuration anymore. So one thing that's really nice is that in addition to putting them here, there's a new thing where in your personal user settings, you can define them in here. All you got to do is add a keyword, launch. And by the way, all this is autocomplete. So if you do launch, and do a control space, it'll give you all the information about it and then automatically complete this stuff for you. So we'll pull out my launch configuration that I use for PowerShell. I'm pretty sure this is one that you can't scope, so I don't think that this is going to be one that we can do customs, but we'll go ahead and copy this just to show how it works. So I'll take this, paste it here. All right, so the way that this works is I like to have these nice little short names. So now if you go to debug, you'll see now there's all of these and a separator then for the ones that are locally workspace. So these are the ones that work anywhere. But this is anywhere. So if like he was saying, if you go to a C# project, if you go to anything like that, you're going to see these no matter what. So let's find out if we can. So what we'll do is that there's a thing you can do, like if there's certain settings that you only want to apply to a particular language, you can do this bracketing effect. And so for instance, here's my PowerShell example that I'll put out here. If I go here, so with this bracketing effect, you can do anything with the bracket, say PowerShell, and then any settings under here only apply to that language. So for my PowerShell, I want PowerShell Preview to be my formatter. I want certain special word separators. So like I want it to pick up, I don't want it to pick up dollar as a word separator. So I take that out. This just, so when I double click things, I want it to select the whole variable plus the dollar. I don't want it to just grab the text before the dollar. What I want to count as brackets. Like I want region and end region to count as brackets. So if I do a region something, I'll do that. I want to be able to collapse that. So that's what that is for. And then semantic highlighting. This is just a nice thing. I want word-based suggestions off because it drives me crazy when I do like get child item dash and down here like at the bottom is like all the words that I've used in my entire code. Like I usually don't care about that, not for PowerShell. So I don't want it to show me those, just to show what that looks like when it's on. I don't really have anything defined in here. Let's see if that will do Okay, well, the word thing's not showing up anyways right now, but typically you have like all this stuff that doesn't matter. So I just want this, and I have another thing that I set that says snippets are always at the bottom. So I always want to see relevant contextual stuff first, and then I want my snippets at the bottom. All right, so yeah, I think no, this is file completer, so that is actually correct. So what we can do in this bracket then, so we can, let's see if we can take our launch and put it just in there. The reason I don't think this will work is because it's a language bound thing, and because this has to happen on a project basis. Like there's no way for it to know, to instantiate that, like unless you open a PowerShell file, that's what you want. And so I think, yeah, the schema is going to tell me you can't do that. Let's see. Yeah, this setting does not support per language configuration. So okay. There's your answer.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, theoretically, I mean, like theoretically, you could make an extension that would detect where you're at and add launch configurations on the fly, but none of that exists today. But I know, knowing the API as I do, you could absolutely make an extension that like looks at the workspace, and if it has PS1s in there, automatically add launch configuration to either your workspace settings or your launch settings, you know, dynamically, and then pull it out when you're not there. So like it's theoretically possible, but it's not easy to do as of today.
Okay, so
I find like this. I generally don't go over here. Pretty much all my runs, almost I never use this over here. I pretty much use, you know, to my own honor, I pretty much use my Pester test extension to do all my run testing, because these basically call launch configurations, and you get the same result, and you get the same debug and everything. So,
and before we come to the questions, just a quick side note: if you, as soon as you add the first launch configuration, like Justin did with the integrated terminal, you have to have the file launch configuration there if you want to press F5. That's a thing that it costs me for the first time half an hour or so. That's a bit. That is the thing that you have to know.
That's a good note. So let me also show you something here too. Is that the reason for that is because F5 is bound to this command. No, let's go. What's the name of the command? It's like launch action or default. Where is it? There it is. So debug start debugging. So the reason that it requires that is because you know, you don't have a debug configuration. But like I said, you can rebind things to anything you want. So if you take that and you rebind it to PowerShell PowerShell run or PowerShell debug pester test or run selection, you know, you can bind it to PowerShell run and have your F5 there. In fact, I like to do, you know, there's that. What I like to do is there's a key here. I think run selection also works. Run selection won't get it directly there, but yeah. So yeah, so you can rebind the F5 to just PowerShell run and kind of get that. Let's go ahead and do that. There's two key bindings that I like to do. Keyboard setting. Let me pull it out. My keyboard shortcuts. I guess I'll just go ahead and show all my custom ones that I like, so it inspires some people. So I like, I have Control-Alt-R for just reload window, because I do that all the friggin' time, so I have that. Align code that I showed, that align, I'm under Control-Shift-A. This one, thankfully, I don't need as much as I used to, but just Control-Shift-F5 to restart my PowerShell window. If I'm debugging, Control-Shift-T to reopen a closed editor. Like if I accidentally close a window, I just hit Control-Shift-T and it comes right back. I have this Control-Shift-T also bound to test, but it's a different context. I like Control-Tab for cycling through terminals in my thing there. I haven't saved it on this, so none of these are going to take effect. F1 to run that command that I had. So, and then the one that, where is it? Yeah, so this one, PowerShell run selection. So you bind this key, Alt-Enter. My keyboard shortcuts, flip it. Put that in here. So I like this one because this works like how the F#, you can just select this and do Alt-Enter, and it'll run whatever code you're selected. So this by default works on F8, but I like Alt-Enter because a lot of other extensions bind it to Alt-Enter, so that's just how I like it. It lets me run any code like that. So let's go ahead and try it with run PowerShell. So let's go to keyboard shortcuts. Let's search for PowerShell run. And let's bind that to F5. The existing commands have this key binding. So we can go ahead and say, for instance, take this one, remove that binding. Oops, remove the wrong one. Remove those two first. don't need that for debugging. Let's go for PowerShell.run. Take this one, F5. Okay, so now we have my script. Make sure I'm not in the debugger, F5, and that works. In fact, if I now delete my launch configuration, now F5 works even if you don't have a launch configuration. So like I said, there's always workarounds for stuff, but that's good. That is good to know. Like if you hit F5 by default and you're used to it, especially if you're in like a new project and you don't have the user space settings like I do. See, I have those user space settings, so I always forget about it because I always just have it built in. But if you don't have those and you're still setting your launch configurations per project, then yeah, if you hit F5, because F5 means run the default debug configuration, and that may mean something different to each workspace. Like in my VS Code editor, F5 actually starts up a whole VS Code instance. Like if I open VS Code PowerShell, let's see, do I have the well, I won't get into that, but basically, like if you're doing a more complex thing, you can bind F5 to basically run any kind of launch configuration. So if you're always expecting it to do something specifically PowerShell, it's best to bind that to something else. You know, it could be F5, F8, whatever. Again, all of this is fully configurable. Every command that exists in VS Code, you can bind to a keyboard shortcut and specify a context. So like hitting F5 when you're in the terminal can do something different than hitting F5 when you're in an editor, or hitting F5 if you're not in debug mode. Like you can set all kinds of criteria, which are really great. Again, you can make it so F5 only does the PowerShell run if you're in a current file and the current language you're on is PowerShell. So if you hit F5 in a different file, it's not going to try to run the PowerShell extension. You know, it just won't do anything, or it'll use whatever F5 works in that scope. So keyboard shortcuts are extremely powerful in VS Code. Definitely worth taking the time to set it up how you like it. So.
And that's all. And that's you also can make a copy of the keybindings.json if you want to do it or sync it with the settings sync.
Once you get what you like, you can just hit this flip and copy paste if you want, and otherwise, yeah, as mentioned, you can just do the settings sync. There is also this new feature. I don't think it's in. Yeah, okay, it is in stable. So this thing, export settings as a profile. You can now do this and just dump all your settings as a file and then import it somewhere else. That's helpful if you're working in an environment where settings sync isn't allowed, like if you're in a lockdown environment that doesn't allow outbound access to GitHub or Microsoft to go pull those settings sync. It's pretty rare, but for some people, like this is a thing. So you can simply just dump it to a file, or you can dump your settings to a file for other people to come in and import. You know, like I could take this, dump it to a GIST. And what's nice about this is like once you dump it to a GIST, you can tell somebody like, oh, you want my settings the way that I have them? Just do import from a profile. And if you have the GitHub extension installed, you can provide the URL. So I could just do, I could have a URL that's like git.io/Justin's VS Code settings. So if you have a fresh install like this, you could just do that. It's not going to work because that URL doesn't exist. And it would go down, pull down my settings, and now your VS Code has my settings. So like really handy thing. I don't know how that works in terms of merge or overwrite. It's brand new. I haven't played with it a whole lot, but that is a nice option that exists.
Okay. So let's go to the questions in the chat. We have two questions. The first from Klaas. Can we find which settings belong to which extension? He also brings an example. I have MySQL connections in my settings.json, but the SQL Notebooks extension apparently can't find those. The second thing is I have lots of intelligence autocomplete suggestions that are rather in the way than helping me typing, but I can't find out which extensions is adding all those wrong suggestions. So that's 3 notes. So let's go over that one by one, I think.
Yeah, sounds good. So for instance, so we'll start with like which settings belong to which extension. So the easy way is if you go into the settings pane, open, and just like your user settings. If you type the name of the extension, so I don't have MS SQL connections, but like if you just type, you can type the JSON name of the extension here. So let's just find an example. I don't have everything in my settings. Let's set something. We'll just, I don't know, color info alpha. Okay. Oh, that's why. It's because I had unsaved settings. Let's try that again. Okay, so there's an example. So, so I have this extension. I want to know. I have this setting, but I want to know what extension it comes from. So all I got to do is color info, and it'll automatically color info dot color info dot excluded fields, and it'll narrow right to the extension that matches that. So you can see color info excluded fields. So that's an easy way to find it. the other thing might be when you say the SQL Notebook extension apparently can't find those. I'm not quite sure what that means. Can you explain that to me, Klaus?
That's also the thing I just want to ask. So he's typing.
Yeah, I see.
And maybe go through the last thing. I have lots of intelligent autocomplete suggestions that are rather in the way than helping while typing, but I can't find out which extension is adding all those wrong suggestions.
Yeah, so that comes, if you look at each extension, there's a header that says connections, but none shown.
In the MS SQL pane, so I have the MS SQL installed. So you mean the SQL Server stuff where you can add connections, I think. These are configured in the settings file. I have them in my settings file, and they will show up every time I redo my VSCode. So that's
yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty extension specific. I don't know much about it, but I do know what I can say is that settings usually live in one of three places. They either exist in user workspace, or if you're using a project workspace, there's an additional file that those can be saved in. So workspace is your local system, user is global to all applications you use, and then the project one, here I could just do a new project. We'll do a save workspace as code workspace. And so now I should be in there. And now if I look at my settings, yeah, see now I have user workspace, and then the individual folders in the workspace can all have different settings. And so these all merge together, and there's logic. I believe it's folder overrides workspace overrides user. So like if you have a setting in on-the-fly demo, so for instance, if that's a single setting like MS SQL connections, and you define it in your user space, but you also define it at the folder level, it's not going to merge them, to my understanding. So like if your folder level, you have it set, but it's blank, it's going to take precedence over your user level one. And so that might be why it's blank in one project, but not another, because you have it explicitly set. So if you go in there and just explicitly delete it out of the JSON file, then you should get your user connections back. That might be what your problem is. I think the way that the API works in the extension is you can fetch at these different levels. So it would, by default, I think it just goes by precedence. It doesn't merge them. However, it is possible if an extension is written correctly, it can merge those. Like the extension can have enough intelligence to look at each level, and if it supports, like if it's like an array, to take each one of those levels and merge them together as a single array. The extension would have to be written, like it has to be written in TypeScript for the extension to support that, though. So it is possible, but it requires the extension to support it. By default, I think it just overwrites. Then the next thing is for the variable view. Yeah, so the variable debug view, because the way that it works is that you can't, I'll show a nice trick for that actually. So let's go back to my script. So by default, that variables view, if you go run, you'll notice that typically this is blank. And it's only when you actually run something that you see the variables pane. So you can choose variables. I don't think it even shows up if you try debug variables pane. Focus on debug. Yeah, debug console is not relevant for what we do here. I don't think there is like a focus on variables view. Yeah, it's just a focus on the debug pane. So, but what you can do is I have my script here. I got my terminal down here with the PSIC. Let's kill all this. I've made a whole mess here now, so let's kill all this stuff out. Restart my PowerShell session. So bring up a new one. And by the way, quick thing is that if you ever have issues with Intellisense, because this the extension was made to be ISE compatible, everything has to flow through this integrated console. So if the integrated console is closed, your Intellisense won't work. If you do something like this, like sleep 30, that blocks the console, and now you'll notice Intellisense doesn't work again. So as long as your console's not blocked, then Intellisense will work, because it has to go through there for a lot of technical reasons, to make sure it has the right context, that kind of stuff. But that's just an FYI, is that like, if you feel like your Intellisense isn't working, make sure your console isn't locked up, or make sure it's not closed. And it always makes sure, like, if you accidentally close it, it always lets you know, hey, it's closed. I kind of wanted to update this message to say, like, if your PowerShell session isn't running, Intellisense won't work, so that people are aware, like, hey, you shouldn't just close this. But we might, I might actually do that as a PR pretty soon. But all right, so to get to your original question, because I am the king of tangents, what you can do here is that variable pane, when you go to run, so if I do a PowerShell run, which just triggers a debug session, when you hit a breakpoint, see now the variables pane comes up. So by default, like, you have to be in debug to see where you're at with this. However, one thing that you can do is, there's those debug sessions, there's that interactive session. So if I do the launch config in my folder, and let's do the interactive session. So now that I have an interactive session defined, the variables isn't there, but if I start my interactive session, once you hit a breakpoint is when you see that. So if I define a variable x equals 5 in my normal terminal, if you're just doing stuff interactively, you can always just type wait debugger, which will trigger a breakpoint. And now you'll get all the variables. And if I look at my local, there's that $, which is the last command I ran. And you can always just add into the watch. So you have x equals 5. So I can add expression $x. And so I can watch it. And so if I change equals 6, I don't know if this will work until unless I step through it, but it'll update to 6, etc. So you can always, if you're doing an interactive session and you don't want to do like get variable or you want to see something, you can do that by just simply using wait debugger. Anytime you hit a breakpoint is when this all gets updated. In fact, same thing here. So you can do error action preference equals break, and if I run a command that's going to fail, like let's do resolve path not a path dash error action stop, that's going to break at that point. In my script. And see, because that was just command line, I get this sort of blank thing here. But if I made this an actual script, if I did something like, let's see, function test resolve path not a path dash error action stop. What did I do wrong there? Oh. I do test. So it'll break and it'll skip to that point in the script. And so where that executable issue happens. So lots of different ways to do debugging than like the typical run script like you're used to in ISE. Okay, so it looks like Klaus found his issue. So there's 2 different settings, very similarly named, probably for different extensions.
Oh, yeah. Good. Also,
oh, one more thing I wanted to mention, sorry, real quick. If you go here under the feature contributions, it'll list all the settings for each extension. So it's a little more, if you do go to an individual extension, like if you're trying to figure out which extension owns something, if you can't find it with the settings sync, I mean, you can click to each extension you have in there, and you can see all the settings that extension contributes, as well as what their default value is, as well as like if there's a command in the command palette that you have no idea, like, suddenly I have this PowerShell restart, what did that come from? All of those are in here too. So everything an extension contributes is listed in its list. This is kind of nice too. It also lists when an extension activates. So extensions by default don't activate until an extension context happens. So for instance, my Pester test extension doesn't load until it sees that there's a Pester test file. And that just helps keep VS Code fast. Like you don't need my extension loading if you're not going to be doing Pester test stuff. It just slows down the startup. So just another place where, like, as you get more advanced, you can find like all this information about what an extension actually contributes.
It's a really cool tip. Thank you. And also add to the variable stuff. So Justin mentioned Adam Driscoll's PowerShell Pro Tools. So if you buy that, you will get an extra activity pane. And in this activity pane, you have a live variables view of every variable that is there, and it's even working outside of the debug stuff. So that's definitely a plus if you want that. Definitely look at PowerShell Pro Tools. Just to add that. So, do you have any other questions? Any other stuff that we want Justin to cover? I just looked through my settings if I can add something. Is there a way to indent files in folders a little bit more to recognize it is a little bit easier? I think you mean the folder view, I think. Yes, I think there's a way.
Yeah, so if I go back to my default one, so you'll notice with my default one, like if I, let's just open something that's got a lot of crap in it. Let's go with VS Code PowerShell is a good option. So you'll notice with mine, everything's indented, folders, etc., fancy icons, all that stuff. This is all from an extension called VS Code Icons. So if I open my settings, I know it's broken. So there's a lot of editor options, and I think there's one here for folder indent. Yeah, it's in here somewhere, but basically, like, there's all kinds of options to configure, like how deep these indentations are, what the icons look like, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So, so as you can see, here's mine. It's set up like this. I honestly don't remember what the setting is. Let's see if I can find it here real quick. It's probably under editor dot, or it's probably, let's see, Explorer. It's probably under Explorer dot. I don't see it.
It's workbench.tree.indent, I think it is.
Okay.
Yes, tree.
Yeah, there you go. So tree indent. So how far you want it to indent in pixels. So say I change this to 20. Now everything moves over further. You know, I get 500. Like, that's how you roll. Oh, yeah. Okay. It's got some sanity check to it. Let's see, like, if you want stuff super indented, there you go.
I will paste it in the chat so that Thomas can copy it.
Yeah, I like 8. Some people like 10. You know,
yeah.
Whatever floats your boat.
Or if you want to configure it visually, you can. No, I think visually it doesn't work. So you only have to set.
Yeah, I think you just. But I mean, you just change it in real time between 8 and 40, and then you're just like, just change it, save. It's like, okay, that looks good. So like 20 is good if you want to have, like, if you want your things not to be directly under each folder. Some people like it that way. Like, I'm fine with 8. Like, I just need enough to visually see the difference, because I tend to try to keep this like super narrow over here so I can focus on my code. Oh, also, speaking of focus on code, if you don't know about this, you can do Zen mode, and everything goes away except what you're working on. So sometimes, like, if you're trying to get into like a flow state and just focus on what you're working on, that's pretty handy, and then you can just come out of it again.
And by the way, if you want to do the indent guide stroke lines, if you want to have them in a different coloring,
yes.
It's also working with the workbench color customization tree.indent guide strokes. I just paste the Stack Overflow article in there that I have open. So if you are interested.
Yeah. I mean, the best thing to do is, like, if you want to explore, like, this highlights some things, but literally just go to the settings UI and then just start stepping through this stuff, because everything's got descriptions. It explores what it is. As soon as you save it, the vast majority of them take effect in real time. And, you know, again, and even if you screw something up, it's really easy to just flip over here, find the setting you had, and just delete it. So, like, totally worth exploring. Like, you know, half of the tips here were just me going through here. And I go through here about every year. Like, I come back and I go through every single thing. And I'm like, oh, that's new. I didn't know that that was a thing, you know, and then try that setting and see, you know.
Yeah, that was really time saver, because if I think back in the early days, there wasn't the settings UI. You can configure everything through JSON. So that's.
Yeah, and you had to kind of discover it. It wasn't super discoverable. Like, you had to kind of discover it through the Intellisense. But now you have this really nice UI to discover everything. And the same is true for, if you haven't used Windows Terminal lately, it now has also a nice GUI interface, where before it was JSON only. Yeah.
So Justin, are you using To-Do Tree a lot?
I do use To-Do Tree a lot. I have it over here. And so if you look in here, here's all the different files, and it'll show. Basically, when you write a to-do, all you got to do is write to-do or hack or whatever. And so I usually write my stuff there, like, as I'm writing a new thing, I'll put in those kind of things. And then what you have is this nice thing called To-Do Tree, where you get this nice little breakdown where you can go and look at the individual places where you put those to-dos or helps or hacks or whatever, and go find them and then go back and fix them. It's really useful for, like, prototyping something real quick and then coming back to, like, fill in the gaps. Like, to-do, you know, do more error handling here. Like, you know, don't just, you know, do a catch-all catch, for instance. Yeah.
And you also configure the text, so you can extend it in the settings, that you can say, okay, I want bug, hack, fix me to do, and so on.
Yeah, you can change the emojis. Like, I have different code icons for mine. Like, you know, for like the I use a little bomb icon for the, you know, for the fix me ones, kind of a deal. And you can make them so they show up super red. And, like, yeah, there's some, like, when you put in the to-do, you can make it so they show up in the problems pane. And if they're in the problems pane, you can have them so they show up in the error lens. So, like, there's all kinds of neat, like, synergies that exist that way.
It's really nice. I use that also a lot to
If you do a lot of REST API work, Thunder Client is awesome. We'll replace Postman. And you can basically do all that kind of Postman stuff you would do, but all just keep it in VS Code. So here I am, like, simulating a 429 too many requests with HTTP stat. But you got all this stuff, and you got docs, you got headers, you got cookies, you got, you know, all the stuff you would typically do with Postman, but it's all natively integrated into VS Code. So you can just ditch that side application.
Yeah, I used REST client for a while, where you can
this is
your REST stuff through a file. Yeah. So that's also handy.
Yeah, another one with me is like Markdown Preview now supports Mermaid. So if you're writing a Markdown file, this is just good for help. You know, if I just do a Markdown file, and do a preview, and let me go find a Mermaid example.
And there's also an extension if you want, if you are interested in doing some Markdown files for GitHub. There's also an extension for this.
Yeah, so those are included in the PowerShell extension pack.
Ah, okay.
If you see here, it does all that, and you'll see like you can now make diagrams with text, and this works in GitHub. So if I save this to the GitHub and publish it, you'll actually see this on the GitHub page.
That's nice. How do you get to this arrows between A and B in the?
Oh, it's just bad because my first. Sorry, say that again. Sorry.
So in the Markdown you write this A and then to the thing between A and B. So it's a special kind of arrow. So how do you write this, or is it just a prettier stuff?
So this is all called Mermaid. So it's got all of its own. So like this arrow, this arrow has special meaning, like the graph. And so like here's a sequence diagram. So here's my participants, and here's how the sequence works. And so now I have this. So like you could make this git host my server. I think these can't have dashes in them. Right? I don't know how picky this is, but. Oh, and then these others don't have, but you get the idea. So you can do these things where basically, like, before you use like Visio and stuff to have this would be a hard file. Now it can actually just be text, and that text will be rendered. And this works in GitHub. So if you have a, let's find a GitHub. Find us like this. Probably just the Mermaid.js is using it natively. Yeah. So if you look here, so here's a GitHub page. And here you have all these items in actual Mermaid format, and you can see you can even highlight the text in them because it's rendered as text. If I go to the actual Mermaid source, like if I go to the README source, you'll see that it's not image references. You see, it's not image references; it's sequence diagrams and flow charts. And so you can just write, this is fairly new. This is new within like I want to say a month or so. But yeah, so now you can do these text-based diagrams that are still like fairly easy to read, even in the text-based format. Like, it's pretty obvious to figure out what's going on here with like a flow chart. But actually now you have these diagrams, so you can have the diagrams in your document, but then manage them as code. So you can PR a diagram change, for instance, without having to PR it as an image. And and it's more accessible, so people who are blind or otherwise, they can have readers that can explain the flow charts and that kind of thing. It's overall a greater thing, and the fact that it's like natively supported in GitHub is great. I don't think it's natively supported in DevOps yet, so if you use DevOps, you're kind of out of luck. But at least if you use GitHub, it's natively supported here. And the Markdown preview here with a certain extension, which again is in the pack, but I'm pretty sure it's just called the Markdown Mermaid thing. Yeah, Markdown Preview Mermaid support. Matt Bierner, again, who does Code 2020, this guy cranks out great extensions, adds that. And so now just your real-time preview will have that there.
Okay, and this was my question. So the arrow is in code with the 2 lines, but I think you have the prettier extension installed.
The fact that I have ligatures enabled?
Yes. Oh, okay.
I didn't show ligatures. Let's see. Let me choose a font. But where's my editor? So for instance, you'll notice if I do like arrow, 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 dash, it looks like that. If I do that, notice how it becomes that kind of arrow. It becomes like that kind of arrow, and it always comes together. And for instance, a better example of this is like, I got not, I got equal. If I do not equal, it becomes a different symbol. These are called ligatures. So this depends on your font. The text is actually still the same. So underneath, this is still just exclamation mark. This is still just like that. But this is done with your font. So I have a font that I like. It's called Cascadia Code, which is the default font for Windows Terminal. And I've come to just really like it as a coding font. Another great ones I recommend are JetBrains Mono is great. Fura Code is great. And there's a great site called programmingfonts.org. that if you go to, you can just look at a bunch of different fonts in your theme of choice. And then just look like, hey, you know what? I like that one. And then you can go get that font. You usually have a link to go get it. And then to add it to VS Code, you have to have it installed in your system. But if I go editor font, so editor font family. So you see here, I have like Delusion. So Delusion nerd font. Nerd fonts are fonts that have a whole bunch of extra symbols added to them. So you have like sort of your default set. I don't think that's it. So you have like your default set of images. And then you have this thing where basically you have all these different additional glyphs that are added into the font automatically. So you can have on your command line. A good example that you'll see here is like when if you look here on my command line, you see like this little thing. That's not an emoji. That's actually part of the nerd font for branch, but it's an actual character as opposed to being an emoji like that is. And so really nice, handy. But one of the things they included these things called ligatures. So here I have for my font ligatures. So if I split this to the left, here's my mermaid. Let me turn my ligatures off, set it to false. Now this probably looks like what you would expect. So this is how you actually type it. But the ligatures just makes it so these sort of things that are typical like programming operators have this sort of special look and special meaning. So it takes a little getting used to, but it's really nice because it'll just let you start to sort of look at that stuff that way. And it just makes it more clear in my brain, like, oh, this is an operator. It's not a typo, or it's not a particular kind of text I'm trying to do. So let's see. I think VS Code has a view of let's see, Cascadia code ligatures. I think they have it on their site of just a picture of them. Yeah. So like here's all the different ligatures it supports. So this key becomes that. This becomes that. So just a nice thing. If you don't like it, you turn it off. It's real simple. But that's just
if you want it with ligatures, I think it's Cascadia Cove. I think if you go to nerdfonts.com, that is
so Cascadia Cove is a nerd patched font version because I can't call it Cascadia Code because that's protected. But yeah, I use it. So if you saw mine, it says Cascadia Cove nerd font. That's because that's the one that I use that I like because it includes all the nerd font characters as well as all those. And if there's one that you want to pick, like if you're on Windows, you want to pick the Windows compatible. Don't pick the mono one. It's auto-generated. It doesn't mean anything specific. Cascadia Code is already mono, so you don't need to choose that. But the lost my train of thought. Yeah, you just want typically. Let's just go get it here real quick. Nerd. I think actually, look, it was right there. Yeah, so it's out here on the GitHub, and so if you browse down here, there's a few different weights, so you can choose the kind of weight you want. So it's basically like how bold it is by default. The regular is good. I kind of like the light. It's a little bit narrower, a little bit cleaner. This is all just visual preference. There's no right answer. But if you go in here, there's like a bunch of different fonts. So the one that you want is complete if you're on anything but Windows. If you're on Windows, you want this complete Windows compatible, and just ignore this mono one. It gets generated as a result. You pretty much don't need it because it's already modified. And so, but you'll notice the name's different, Cascadia Code, because they can't call it code because that's trademarked by Microsoft. But all you got to do is click this guy, download it, install it. Now you have the font, and then all you got to do is set it in your VS Code settings for the font that you want. Another thing about the settings too for the font family is you can set an order of preference. So this is useful if you're syncing across different computers. So in mine, like I want this font. Some computers don't have that, but some computers have this. And if they don't have that, I want to fall back to Consolus, which is on every computer. So and so then for my debug console, I have a bunch of different fonts that I want, based on different things. So keep that in mind. Is you don't just have to specify one font. You can specify an order of preference. And if that font's not installed, it'll fall back to the next one. Really helpful if you're syncing across a bunch of different computers.
Okay. Any other questions to Justin?
Yeah. Konstantin and Justin, I've got a question about the settings thing. So first thing I'd like to thank for the presentation. I definitely learned something new today. Great one. Due to the fact I'm using the classical settings things extension, right, which is there for about a decade, I think. I haven't played with the Git with the integrated one. And due to the fact I have different computers with some different file sets and some different folder settings, is there a way in the VS Code integrated settings sync where I can specify settings individual for my personal PC, for my personal laptop, for my working laptop?
Yeah, as far as like sync, so there, you can basically choose to exclude certain settings from sync. So there's not a thing where you can define like profiles, where you can say this is for this system or this is for that system.
Okay.
But with your settings sync, you have this option for you can show the settings, and under here you have options for ignored extensions, where like I don't want these, I only want these, I don't want these extensions to sync across. So like you can use this to basically do an established baseline, and then you have ignored settings. So for instance, for ignored settings, like I ignore auto check updates. My PowerShell default version is different on certain systems. I don't want it to sync that. I'm going to set that personally on each system. And what my integrated Windows shell, sometimes it's PowerShell Preview, sometimes it's PowerShell, sometimes it's PowerShell, depending on what system it's on. I don't want it to sync that. So you can just specify those settings in there, and then it'll keep those. It won't sync those. And then once you download the settings, then you can do this, whatever those per system settings you want to do on that individual computer.
Okay, so as far as I understand, you exclude the settings which are you doing individually on each of your computers.
Right. You basically use this to establish a common baseline, and then for the individual computers, then you go into those and do different settings for those. I use a tool called Chamois to usually do that kind of stuff, to set up my individual environments. Chamois is like setting sync, but for anything like dot files and such. So for instance, like my PowerShell profiles, that kind of a thing. This is a handy tool. It's written in Go, so it works on Windows, Linux, Mac, wherever. It works in Azure Cloud Shell. So, basically you just run this, and you have a GitHub repository. And in that repository, I think I have one public one. Let's see if it shows. I have a private one that has some stuff in it, but I think I think it's either Shizmar. I think it's just dot files. Yeah, and Patrick has a good one too. So for instance, my default VSCode profile with all my settings, my key handler, all that kind of stuff is in here. And then it also includes some other things, like in terms of different, like some of my SSH stuff, in terms of I want an SSH folder, I want a special editor config, I want a special git config. And so all you do is you run Chamois, once you're on the system, and it'll pull down and keep things in sync. So all I get, once I update it in my repository or from my master system, it syncs all the other computers. So that's a way to configure, and that'll work for the settings JSON too. But like that's just a different option. You don't need to go that far. Just the normal settings sync is fine. But it has these options for ignoring settings. And it has an option for also per platform key bindings. So you can also define like certain key bindings on Linux versus different key bindings on Windows, etc. But those all sync to all computers. So.
Okay, good to know.
Does that help?
You.
Yeah.
Yep.
Works great, super great. The storage is free, so you just choose GitHub or Microsoft, and they just use a special storage that's available in your profile that they keep it there. It backs up settings, so if you make changes to your settings and you screw something up, you can just go to your settings history, which is really nice. So like if you do something, you can open your backups folder, and that's all there. It syncs your UI state. So for instance, if I put the bar over there, or I want to take my terminal and move it over here, it'll remember that. And you can always just reset it. In the settings sync options, one of them is to say, just wipe it out.
Great, thank you. Yep.
Yeah, it also has.
So here's all my different settings. It updates constantly. So every time I made a change today, like I can see it as of 6 minutes ago, 8 minutes ago, 15 minutes, 16, 17. Like every time I made a change, I can go back and look at it, and also see what's different between my current and what was changed. So. Really well done by the VSCode team. I stopped using I used the other settings sync for a while. I stopped using that about 2 years ago, and I haven't missed it. So.
Yep. Yeah, and the other thing that I mentioned before, if you set up settings sync, you get not only asked if you want to go with GitHub or with Microsoft, it also asks you if you want to go with the insiders or with the normal, with the really productive version, so you can use that to have two different settings sync sets for this also. So that's another that's another one you can use. You have two different settings sync configurations.
One thing to note though there is I think it only asks you that in insiders. So if you're using stable and you do the sync, it's not going to ask you. You don't see that.
Okay.
So just remember that it'll only show it to you if you're in insiders. Otherwise it'll just assume stable.
Okay, so that it's okay, yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so I think there are no questions. Then Justin, thank you for presenting.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Just a quick plug. I'll be at PSConf EU. I'll be in Vienna, so I got a couple sessions there, and I'll see you there if you're going.
Definitely. So let's meet up and have another chat. So, or have another beer or so. Yeah.
Or 2 beers in the case of Jaap.
Or 2 or 3 or X beers or so. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so next presentation will be in June, 2 weeks before the conference, and we have Stevie Coaster on, who is talking about Crescendo. I'm also very much excited about this because it's a really nice, PowerShell module that is from the PowerShell team that just got G8. So, and it's really cool if you want to have command line tools made as PowerShell modules. So it's I think it can be a really cool session. And yeah, I will do the meetup appointment I think next week, and then let's see. Okay, thank you, Justin, again for presenting, and see you in Vienna or see you next month. Bye bye.